You are locked in and listening to another episode of the What's Next podcast, where we talk all things accounting, business, and how to be better at it as well, Phil. And this one from the archives, one of the old favourites of ours, not just to talk about, but to be queried about as well, to lease or to buy those vehicles. Normally vehicles, sometimes assets in general, but normally the question is, should I lease or buy this vehicle?
Yeah, we haven't heard from Lease Or To Buy for quite a while.
No.
We were just down in, I think we're down in the Bay last time she got in touch.
The Gold Coast, actually.
Was it the GC?
Yes. 2021 maybe? Or it would have been lockdown by then. Yeah. Don't know, some time ago, but we were definitely
Some time ago before Lease Or To Buy got in touch.
Yep.
And we got a phone call from her recently and we thought, well, geez, Lisa, we don't want to scrub through the archives. Let's revisit this top-rated and most inquired about topic. And again, just like wages and drawings, which we've covered off before, there's no right or wrong answer.
Oh, every accountant's favourite to say, look, it depends.
It does, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we could just cut the pod to that. Yeah. What's the answer for Lease Or To Buy? It depends.
Let's give people the data in terms of what we see. Now, I reckon, I sometimes say 90, but I reckon it's over 95. Probably 95% of our clients, or even higher, buy and finance their vehicle.
Yes.
I would say 5% or less would actually lease a vehicle. So then that allows us to dive into what those two things actually are. So which should we go first with, mate? Let's do leasing.
Lisa, I was going to touch on leasing. Yep.
Yeah, old Lisa.
Lisa the Lisa.
So at a very high level, leasing, for me, the way that I look at it, or to keep it within a minute, is basically you go and you lease the vehicle. It's an operating expense to you. You pay that. It's just like renting a house.
I was just about to say, because you were leasing, it's borrowing. So we're borrowing the use of the car. So it's like a library.
Yep.
You've rocked up and you go, I want to take this book out, but we're going to take this car out. And rather than showing your library card, you're going to fill out an automatic payment form and fill out a whole heap of other punishing forms, no doubt, at the same time. And you're going to get to borrow and use that car. And let's use an example of a car rather than leasing any other kind of asset, but use that car over a fixed period. And you could lease it for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years potentially. So yeah, it's borrowing, and
but not borrowing money. Let's just be clear on that.
We're borrowing to use the car.
Yes.
Because at the end of that period, you have to give it back.
Just like you would if you were going away on holiday and you go and lease a vehicle for the 7 days that you're there.
And it's not like an overdue library book that you just go, oh, sorry, I've forgotten about it, and then the reminder notice that it's go in the bin. You do have to return the motor vehicle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's frowned upon if you don't return it.
Yeah. So it's an expense to you each month. You claim the GST on it normally, if it's all for business use, of course. Let's just presume that.
The other point to clarify is we're talking about an operating lease.
Yes. Yeah.
Not a finance lease.
No, which will come to as part of buying, right?
Yes. Gee, the variabilities.
Yeah.
Huge.
So we've already confused everyone.
Yeah, including ourselves.
Yeah. So you're basically renting a car from some place and you are paying for that in the frequency of probably monthly, and there's a term in which you can rent that from them for, and you've got to give that back at the end of that. And less than 1 in 20 of our clients do that.
Yeah. And I guess you're probably listening to this and going, hey, Luke and Phil, great, you've explained a lease, but why would I choose to lease?
Yes.
And there's a number of different things. And when I talk to clients about it, if they're coming to me and saying, and when Lease Or To Buy first got in touch, I'm like, well, hey, Lisa, are you a car kind of person? Like having the latest and greatest car every 3 or 4 years, is that important to you? Because if it is, you probably want to look at leasing, because leasing gives you the flexibility to borrow the car, you can use it for the 3 or 4 years, and then by the time that period's over, you're going back to the dealer, and there's going to be the latest model of whatever it is that you're buying. Ford Ranger, they're updating those every few years. New ones, had a look at those, pretty cool. Don't think they're as cool as the last one in terms of looks, but that's another matter.
Give me a Raptor.
Oh, yes. Man, they're expensive.
Yeah.
But anyway, it gives you the flexibility to go, right, I've had enough of this Ranger, give me another one. I had white last time. That wasn't so practical for having a ute because I am actually going off-road in it. unlike every other Aucklander and their Ranger. This time I want a black one. And not only do I want a black one, I'm going to pimp it up a little bit. So that's part of the decision making. So if that's important to you, the other thing with a lease is it's got fixed operating costs. You know, from a cash flow planning point of view, it's going to cost you X amount every single month. And that's on the basis that it's a fully maintained operating lease. So every time you tick over the 15,000 case and you're hooning up and down that blimmin' motorway up north, because you've got to go and do all the work at those houses at Omaha, you can go in and get your car serviced, and that's included in your lease cost, assuming it's a operating lease that's fully maintained.
Yeah.
You could get a lease that's non-maintained, then the maintenance costs are going to be over and above the lease cost. But there's a certain element of locked-in cost for knowing what it's going to...
Would you say that normally an operating lease is higher than what a repayment on a vehicle is?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because of exactly what you just said there, right?
You're paying for the flexibility.
Yeah.
And you're paying for a premium of the ability to return it and then swap it. So it's like, I've gone to the library and I've borrowed the Guinness Book of World Records, 2024. I want to return that in a year's time because the 2024 edition of the Guinness Book of World Records is now out of date. I want to be rolling around strutting my stuff for the 2025 edition of the Guinness Book of World Records.
Well, we actually had a client who leased a Tesla because they weren't sure they're going to hold their value, so they didn't want to buy one, and they thought, well, we'd like the ability to be able to give it back. We might not like it, we might not like electric, it might not be suitable for where we move to, and there might be a shitload of them, so we'd rather not be left holding it in a few years' time and then realise that actually we've still got XYZ to pay on it, and it's only worth half of that because the battery blew out and whatever. So that was the rationale for we're going to lease one.
Yep.
To get a flavour of it. And after 2 months, they loved it so much, they took the lease back and went and brought 3 of them for the whole family. That's not true, but anyway. Shout out to Elon and the crew.
Yeah.
Hey, what about leases, operating leases where they've got the lease you claim the GST on, but then part of it's interest cost as well? How come that happens?
Well, that's where you're buying the car and you're structuring it as a finance lease rather than an operating lease. So a finance lease, you put me on the spot here, mate.
Sorry.
I
guess this highlights there's so many different types.
Yeah, it does have, it's got a loan component to it. So there's a principal repayment and an interest portion, and there's GST on it as well. But there's elements of what would be a traditional lease that you can return the vehicle at the end of the lease period. It's just the finance side of it is structured differently. The important thing to note is because an operating lease is different to a finance lease, you need to be talking to your accountant to make sure that you're treating them correctly.
Yeah.
Because on a finance lease, you technically own the car and you'll be claiming depreciation.
Yeah.
And I guess in your accounts, if you're leasing a vehicle, you're going to have on your profit and loss lease expense, and you'll have your fuel, and that's pretty much it. Maybe some maintenance if it's not an maintained operating lease. Whereas if you own the car, coming back to a lease, there won't be any depreciation.
Operating lease, yeah.
Yeah, and an operating lease, there won't be depreciation, and there wouldn't be any interest either. Whereas comparing it to a vehicle that you own, on the profit and loss report, you're going to have, instead of a lease expense, you're going to have depreciation.
Yeah.
All the other costs will generally be there: motor vehicle expenses, fuel, power if it's an electric car, insurance, maintenance, all those other kind of costs will be exactly the same. So it's just that structuring, whether it's an expense by way of lease payment or depreciation.
And that's where I think if you're in business and you buy a vehicle or lease a vehicle, speak to your accountant, because it's easy to go to a car yard and think that you're signing up for one thing and not realize that you're signing up for something else. And there's so many different, they've got operating leases, financing the vehicle. Then as well, lease to buy. Oh no, I'm leasing this vehicle. Oh, it looks like this is a lease to buy. Who owns it at the end of it? Oh, I'm not sure. You really need to know what you're signing up for. And in the contracts, it will lay out all of these things, basically who does own it at the end. Do you have to pay a lump sum? And people just think that they are doing one thing, but they're actually doing something else.
The other thing to be mindful of on a lease, and typically in an operating lease, there's going to be a mileage allowance. So if you're leasing the vehicle for 3 years, you might only be allowed to do 30,000 Ks or 40,000 or 45,000 Ks. And these finance companies or motor vehicle companies have got some smart software in the background, I think, I've never seen it, but where the lease payment that you're going to pay is going to be based on all the different variables, the type of car, how long you're going to lease it for, how many kilometers that you're going to have baked into the lease agreement. And if you go under that, great, the lease company's probably winning because you haven't used the car anywhere near as much as what you thought you would. So therefore, it would potentially be returned in better condition. So its resale value would be higher because the kilometers are lower. But on the flip side, if you've booked in to do 30,000 Ks over 3 years, but you actually do 40, you're going to have to pay for those extra 10 that you've done.
Yeah. So at a high level then, operating lease of a vehicle, very simply, you're going to pay an amount each month that may have GST on it, probably will, and you'll be claiming that, and you'll be claiming the expense, and that will be your tax deductible expense. Then you might be, spending money on it for fuel and things like that. That's all going to be tax deductible. And then you might have an FBT obligation based on whether you're using that personally or privately. Talk to your accountant about that. But that's as simple as it needs to be. Then if we get into buying a vehicle, which is what 95% of our clients, and if that's a representation of the rest of the business owners around the country, probably what they're doing as well. Basically, they go to the car yard, they say, I would like that vehicle there. They say, that's going to cost you X, Y, Z. Let's bolt on some additionals as well. That comes to this figure. We're going to finance that figure over 3 years, 5 years, whatever it may be.
On the phone to Heartland Bank.
Heartland Bank, let's get it, baby. And they give you an interest rate, or the finance company tells you what that regular repayment's going to be. And so now you own that vehicle, and you then are obligated to make the loan repayments on that. Otherwise, the loan provider will come and they'll take that vehicle and they'll sell it and try and recover that. But basically, you'll claim the expense being the interest on the loan, but not the repayment, just like when we pay down any debt in our business, that's not tax deductible. It's just the interest on that. But we own the vehicle, so it will then depreciate. Now, it depreciates and that expense is recognized monthly. And that expense decreases our profit because it increases our expenses, and then we have less tax to pay. So that's where it ends up hitting the profit and loss. And then on a GST side of things, you won't be paying GST on your loan repayments or your interest, but you will pay GST on buying the vehicle. So that's when you need your accountant to help you figure out if you're able to claim all the GST up front. Which a lot of finance is these days, because then they ask for the GST portion back in month 2 or 3.
So many people, that still catches them by surprise. That if you are buying a motor vehicle for business purposes, you get to claim the GST on the full purchase price of the vehicle. And the finance companies are smart. They go, well, you're going to be getting a refund of the 15% of the cost price. We want that money to go against the loan. Thank you very much. And if you're not looking at the loan schedule that goes with the purchase documents for the car, it could potentially catch you by surprise. And it's caught a few clients by surprise in the past where they go, oh shit, this bigger payment came out in this month and I wasn't planning for it.
Especially if you're behind on tax and you get a GST refund and the IRD go, we're not going to send that to you. We're going to allocate that to a past debt. And all of a sudden you go, holy, the loan provider is going to direct debit my account for the 15% of that vehicle. I'm in trouble now. Then
the catch. And I guess having, where you think that buying a vehicle with debt is going to be advantageous from a cash flow point of view up front, it's probably not. Because you think, I'm going to get the GST, as we've just explained. No, that's going to go to the finance company. You can structure the loan to go, no, I won't. I'll keep that cash, and then your loan terms will change. But you have to ask for that because paying the GST back to the finance company is standard. And typically with a vehicle, unlike a lease, you have to pay a deposit. I haven't seen somebody go and buy a vehicle without some form of deposit up front. They might have a trade-in, which means there's no deposit, but typically there's some form of initial cash outlay.
Might even be $500 or $1,000.
Yeah.
Something.
Yep. In most cases, from what I've seen, 5 or 10 grand for an initial deposit for a car. And it's just like, oh, gee, if you were leasing that car, you just have to wait for your first monthly installment and roll out this. So just be mindful of the cash flow impacts when buying a car. The other thing, because you own it, it's going on your balance sheet and it's an asset. Yes, that asset's going to depreciate, but you do need to be mindful that, if it's one of these electric cars, it might swing and actually go back up in value. And it could be depreciating real quick, and then there might be some depreciation recovery in time.
Good point.
But if you're comparing it back to that original lease thing, leases are great if you like flexibility. So if flexibility and all that kind of stuff isn't important to you, buy the car, and then you'll go, right, I'm happy with my Black Ranger, mint it out, and I'll have this for 5 or 7 years and I'll have no issue with kilometres. I'm quite happy maintaining it, happy days. And then when I'm sick of it or get bored of it, then I can make a decision about what I do next. Do I use it as a trade-in? Do I then give it to someone else and then buy something else? There's a whole bit that's your asset. You can choose what you want to do with it at your discretion when you ultimately get bored of it, because that's going to be the trigger. Or you do something dumb, you crash it and write it off, then the insurance company's going to give you a check and you go off and buy something else.
Yeah, mate, love that. The thing that I think we always see with clients when they go and buy a vehicle, we always say to them, almost as a test for a bit of fun these days, it's like, oh, what's the rate you're paying on that? Oh, I think it's, like, why do you think it? How do you not know what your rate is? But if you're leaving a car yard or speaking to a person who's going to provide finance, you want to know what the term is. And when we say what the term is, like Phil said, the cash flow impact. So are you paying a lumpy amount at the end? At the end of the term?
Balloon payments.
Yeah. Like, does this have a balloon payment? Oh, I don't know.
Like you look at, I don't want to name any car dealers or brands in particular, but there are some that do that third, and a third. And you think, oh man, that's cheap.
It's like
third, 100%. But it's once every 3 years rather than 3 times a year, and you're like, sweet. But then that small fine print that you need to have your glasses plus a magnifying glass over the top of those to be able to read it. There's a balloon payment that they haven't pointed out. It's not 3 equals installments. It's like 20 grand, 20 grand, 20 grand 3 times. You think, 60 grand, balloon payment, $35,000.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so be mindful of that. It can be a balloon payment. Sometimes that could be a sign that it is a finance lease rather than operating lease. So rather than a balloon payment, that could be like a guaranteed residual value that you're using when you then go to swap the car back.
Yeah.
It starts and gets a little bit technical, but I guess it ultimately comes down to your personal preferences. And like with the wages versus drawings things, there's no real tax shortcuts here. Over the lifetime of owning a vehicle, if you run the numbers on an average car, they broadly come out relatively similar. By the time you take the deductibles for a lease, being the lease expense and the running costs, versus owning it, depreciation, and the same running costs, the tax position's going to come out pretty much the same. Yeah. If your motor vehicle is a high value motor vehicle, the situation might change. So make sure you're getting some professional advice before committing to something. But for your average kind of car, there's no little cheat or little hack here that you're going to have where it's just like, oh, gee, I should do this because I'm going to blim and be able to get one over the tax man. I think the instances that off the top of my head that I can think where a client does lease a vehicle is where they've got employees and where your employees can change at any given point in time, and you've got a brand that you want to protect and go, right, okay, we want to make sure we've got a fleet of half a dozen cars and they're all out there and they're all the same and they're branded and they look good. And then they're on a cycle of going, right, every 4 years we're going and getting the next model. Or if a new employee starts, we can go to the lease company, let's just lease the next model. Or if somebody leaves, okay, we're going to return the vehicle early. Yes, there's going to be potentially some penalties, there's some costs, but you've got the ability to send it back. You don't need it, rather than having something there that you own and then having to think, now we're lumped with trying to sell it because Bev's upped and left, and she, instead of working for Bernina, she's gone to Bloomin' Fisher and Paykel.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the pool car is a good example of maybe something to lease. You know, we're speaking to a client recently where they want to provide a vehicle for all of the staff, about 8 staff, and we said, well, maybe lease a vehicle, and they've all got used to that. But then you need a system around, okay, who's got it, where is it, who's using it on what day, etc. But that could be your way to do it. And they're like, oh, great, I hadn't really thought about that.
And the other thing to bring up as well, whether you lease or buy the car, the FBT implications are exactly the same. So don't think that because you're leasing it, then there's no FBT issues, or that if you buy it, you can do something differently because of FBT. FBT's got nothing to do with how you structure the car. It's down to whether you're using it privately or not. Your accountant will be able to give you specific advice to your situation, but just a little additional piece there to be mindful of around FBT.
So things to think about when you leave that car out or before you buy a vehicle: rates, terms, and impact to your cash flow. Now, my challenge comes to business owners, and this is that let's look at a $100,000 vehicle plus GST.
Yep.
Now, that's $100,000 after GST. That's probably going to be 30 grand worth of depreciation in year number 1, roughly.
Depreciation rate for a motor vehicle is 30%, I do believe. So I think you've ding, ding. Yay!
30 grand. And then finance on that. So they're probably going to be paying 12 to 13%. Let's just be nice and say 10%. Okay.
Ooh, discount at Heartland.
Yeah.
Well
so
done.
let's say that's basically, by the time they pay their loan fees as well, $10,000 worth of interest in year number 1, plus those loan fees. And let's not even look at anything else. We're not going to jack it up, we're not going to sack it, whatever people want to do, tint it, all this sort of shit. Let's just look at that, $40,000. How many businesses in New Zealand spend $40,000 on advertising and education in a year in their business?
Yeah, not a huge amount.
No.
No.
So I think it's funny that people will go out, get a vehicle, get the expensive one, do all this cool stuff, because I think vehicles, much like other Western countries, New Zealand's become a place where we're like, I can get the finance for that, therefore I'm going to. But just because you can get the finance doesn't mean you should. And that's a really tricky conversation for us to have with business owners, because by the time they get to us, they're basically like, well, I've got my heart set on that. And you kind of think, this sounds a bit rude, but sometimes you're like, you haven't earned the European car yet, the $100,000 vehicle or whatever. Just fucking chill out.
Don't get ahead of yourself.
Yeah, chill out. Drive the $3,000 Corolla. Keep learning, keep advertising, keep growing, and then you can go and get the vehicle if it's still important to you later on. But I think so many business owners that we see, and we get to look at a lot of set of books with our clients, non-clients, they've got the fancy car, and you kind of think, look at the expenses that this vehicle creates each year.
Yep.
And they go, well, yeah, it's bringing my tax bill down. And we go, well, what's your spend on growing yourself, your business? What else are you doing? And sometimes the old, the focus is in the wrong area. And then we're worrying about, what sort of, do we get a vehicle? Do we get a lease? And we're just saying, why don't you just go make more money?
Yeah.
And focus on that first, and then this stuff will come. So I think it's a good reminder, because it's so easy to go and get credit and debt that we go, well, I can, so I'm going to, but don't think about what then that does to tying up our cash flow. For instance, what could we have done if we bought a $30,000 vehicle or a $10,000 vehicle rather than a 70 or a 60 or a 90 or a 100?
And I think that's a really good point, particularly in the times that we're faced with now, because the amount of vehicle brands out there putting offers to get a car at 0% finance, 1% finance, 2%, 3% finance, which is ridiculously cheap money. I mean, we haven't seen money that cheap since you know who was in power.
Yeah, we're getting itchy.
And don't be lured into the fact that cheap money means it's like that's your permission to then make that decision.
Yeah.
Still come back to focusing on, can my P&L support this? Is this the right decision for my business? Is this going to ultimately lead to growth, or am I just trying to take a shortcut because there's an offer out there? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, these businesses, like every other business, have got targets to meet. And when they start dangling that carrot in front of the market, they know that people are going to buy it. Yeah. And it's some low-hanging fruit to go, yep, we can get some quick wins here. Recent data that's just come out, new vehicle registrations
plummeted.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So there's going to be more deals to come.
Yeah.
Let them sweat.
And a long time ago, mate, we gave people good advice for free on this podcast, and that was get rid of your assets before the market does, which is basically we can show you what's going to come, which is what we're now seeing where people aren't buying as many vehicles. And we were saying if you're sitting on assets that you don't need and you need to free up cash, sell them now before the rest of the market does and they're forced to sell, and it tanks the price of these assets. Unfortunately, some clients listen and some people listen and have told us that they went away and did that, but not everybody. But I was recently speaking to a business owner where I was reviewing their business and I looked at their balance sheet and I said, guys, can we have an honest conversation? Do you really need the vehicle that's on that balance sheet? Because there's a guarantee loan repayment that we can get rid of. And their answers were actually quite practical as to why they needed it. However, those practical answers could be matched with, well, a Toyota Hiace van could do that and there's one for $3,000 on Trade Me.
Wow.
But a good example of a business that needs the money to protect the business, but the finance company is still like, yeah, we'll lend you that, because they know when they're giving you asset finance, they will lend you the money because they know that ultimately they can come back and get the vehicle back and go and sell it. And yes, they might do their ass on a little bit of it, but you know, that's not happening yet. So then whilst it's not happening, they keep lending the money on the vehicles and they hit you with a direct debit on the day after you're normally getting paid to ensure that they're going to get theirs. And their biggest risk is that you stop paying and then they come get it and then they salvage the cash and write off the piece that didn't work for them. So it's a brilliant business model when you've got so many people who are like, right, they said I can borrow XYZ for this vehicle. Like they must know what they're talking about. They're looking at you going, okay, what's our level of risk here? Yep, sweet, here you go. Now, we're looking at it objectively and going, oh, your business can afford to pay this, but it can't when we look at all the other things around this. So that vehicle should go. Will it go? Probably not.
It's too much pride in the way.
Yeah, and it's very hard for someone to go, right, I know the right answer here.
There's a lot of Kiwis that are car people, and that Ranger has got quite an emotional attachment to it, and then to be able to part ways with it and go and get the Hiace van is a pretty tough pill to swallow. Very
smart from Ford too. Have you seen their marketing is New Zealand drives a Ranger?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
But then someone's turned it because there's an ad and I think it's like Ranger, and they keep pointing it out. Someone's changed it to wanker. Yeah.
A little bit saltish.
Yeah, good heat, eh?
It is.
Something you always say, mate, I hear across the desk, hey, with that loan on that vehicle, why don't you match it with the useful life of that vehicle?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, one of your great gold pieces of advice, mate, that I often hear you say.
Smart. I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, I couldn't let you forget.
Check, good man. Yeah, and I guess that goes with any kind of asset finance, that if you're buying a vehicle or a piece of plant or machinery, that you want to get the debt term, so however long you're going to be paying the loan back for, to somewhat match how long you'll potentially have that asset for. So, you, again, using the example of a vehicle, because that's what we're talking about, you typically own the car for probably 4 to 5 years if you're going to be owning it. Maybe even longer, 5-6 years. So make sure that the loan matches that kind of period rather than going, oh, I'll do it over 2 to 3 years. Because the cash flow impact means you're front loading a repayment of an asset that's going to have a useful life that's longer.
Yep.
Yes, some people go, oh, but I'm paying interest, da-da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, but it's deductible interest and it's freeing up cash. So rather than having a loan repayment of $2,000 a month to pay it off over 2 years, we're going to have a loan repayment of $800 over 5 years. So we've just freed ourselves up $1,200 a month to then go and spend on bettering yourself, advertising to grow your business.
Yeah. Nice, mate. Yeah. The other angle I guess we could quickly look at just briefly is, tradies, for instance, or businesses where they're not just buying a vehicle for themselves, but they're providing them for their teams. And often we see this as clients start to scale and they like to add in another van or they like to add in new equipment. Asset finance is available for so much of that these days. So again, make sure you understand the cash flow impact. You should have a cash flow forecast. If you keep adding in more layers of debt, they should be itemized line by line. That one's for the Hiace, that one's for the Ranger, that one's for the tools, etc. So you can see how much money is going out each month that you have to pay. That's going to get sucked out.
Yep.
And you need to know, because you need to understand what would happen if one of your clients didn't pay. The Heartland, etc., they're not going to check in with you and be like, hey, did all your clients pay? Because we're about to take our direct debits for your debt. They're just like, ping.
Doesn't suit this month. That's okay. We can just kick the can down the road and you can worry about it later.
Yeah. So you need to understand that part of things. You touched on depreciation recovered before, mate. So let's say you had a vehicle that was 100 grand, it depreciated down to 30. So now it's worth 70,000. The year after, you might go and sell it, and on the books it's now only worth about $60,000. But you sell it for $80,000, then you've claimed $40,000 worth of depreciation, but you've actually only really lost $20,000 on that because it's gone from 100 down to 80. But you've claimed $40,000 of expenses. So now you have to have depreciation recovered, which basically says, okay, that's a form of income, because we've claimed too much of the expense. So that's what depreciation recovered is. We don't often see that, but it happened for a little while when cars were really holding their vehicle and clients were going to sell.
Yeah, during COVID, where people were wanting to offload, particularly utes or work-related vehicles. So you'd see Hiluxes in particular, because obviously that's quality compared to a Ranger. People just selling them for more than what they actually originally paid for them for. It's been unbelievable, the used car market. And I recall back in the COVID days, the car dealers started doing ads going, if you want to sell your car, we will buy it. Because there's just so much demand for cars. Just the impact of the old COVID cash. Thanks, Grant. But that's all come to an end now and everything's just starting to cool off.
Now they're advertising saying, if you'd like to buy a car yard, so we want to get the fuck out of here. Very quickly too, mate, you might not always need debt to buy assets. And we've seen this too, where someone's looking at leasing or buying, and then we look and we go, mate, you're sitting on 50 grand in your slush fund and your backup cash, and you're spending all this time going around getting all these quotes. Why don't you just use 30 grand of your 50? That's all the vehicle is. Or sometimes they're like, oh, it's a 12 grand vehicle. We're like, oh, why are we having this convo? Let's use the 12 grand out of the 50. You'll build that back up. You don't need it. We know them well enough, and we're like, move faster. Go buy it. Bang, out of the way.
Yep.
You claim the GST back. It starts depreciating, and your mind is back on what you need to be focusing on. And instead, we're kind of, well, everyone's financing their vehicles, so I better as well. But it's a good example of speaking to your accountant, and if they know you well enough, they're going to be able to give you that advice of like, yeah, okay, you could look at leasing, you could look at buying, or no, mate, you don't need to be doing this. Just use your cash and go and do that. But they will know as well what you may need to use cash for in the future to then give you that advice. But we've definitely seen businesses sign up for debt where they didn't even need to take it on. And we're kind of going, what have you done that for? Oh, well, Jimmy said that it's always good to borrow when you get your vehicles. And we're like, well, okay, but now you just got thousands sitting over there that could have been deployed. Eventually, when we build up cash, we use it for something, whether it is buying assets, paying down debt, putting it into our own personal situation, deploying it over there.
TOB.
Whatever you're doing with it, right? So you think it's not just like, okay, I've got to build it and leave it there and then just keep taking on debt. But everyone's got the ways that they like to do things.
The other thing that's just jumped into my mind about lease to be mindful of is you're either a car person or a not. If you're not a car person, you probably won't look after it terribly well. And you might just go, oh, I've opened the door and I've smacked it into the pole at the supermarket, or blimmin'
scratched the rims,
got my trolley and blimmin' pushed it into the back of the boot, and oh shit, there's a bit of a scratch. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter if you're a car person. If you lease it, it's important, because when you lease it, it's got to come back in at a particular condition, and they ping you, I believe, if there's dents and stuff in it, because ultimately they just want to be able to sell it again.
Yeah.
Whereas if you own the car, it's like, wow, you know, that little ding in the bonnet or on the scratch in the side door, that's not a big deal. And when I ultimately come to sell it or trade it in, the dealer's just going to look at it and go, well, I'll give you X for it, and whether there's a ding in it or not, it's not really going to impact the value of the car. The other thing to be mindful of is if your car's sign written, at the end of the lease, you're going to have to take that stuff off.
Yeah.
So that's another cost that you're going to need to be mindful of. If you own it, yeah, you get to have a sign written car for life, or you're sitting at home one weekend peeling that shit off.
Yeah. That's a good point, mate. And I actually was going to touch on
It's going to make rebranding's difficult if you like to go through that every 3 years.
you wouldn't want to do it if you're an accounting firm. A shout out to all those accounting firms that rebrand out there instead of doing actually any work to bring in clients because they think that's what's going to solve their problems. And all business owners that think that actually, we'll do a rebrand. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Right, what's the strategy? Yeah, sorry. So what I was going to say is if you're going to spend all this money on a vehicle and you don't do any advertising, you don't go out there, you don't put yourself out there, God's sake, put some branding on the vehicle. Do something, you pussy. You know, do something to advertise your business. Put some branding on the side.
I've said to one client in particular, I don't think that they listen to this podcast, but they have a vehicle that's branded, and I've said to them on a number of occasions, because they are driving all over the show, they should put a QR code that's quite easily scannable with some text above it or below it or around it saying da-da-da-da-da, scan it, and it'll go straight to a specific landing page to be able to go and buy.
Yeah.
Because the amount of people in Auckland that are stuck in traffic at any one time, it's fucking everybody, unless it's 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning and you're blitzing at 150 down the motorway.
Wow.
I don't do that, but just if some people do. There's a lot of cars around and we're moving slow. Don't be using your phone while you're driving. So obviously when that car's parked and you're walking past, you're scanning it. Or your passenger, give the phone to them. Say, scan this QR code, because we don't want to encourage breaking the law. But that's a little hack for sign-written cars, QR code.
Well, there we go.
Billboards on 4 wheels.
Yeah. Yeah. Love it. Righto. There you go. Leasing or buying. As always, speak to your accountant. Let them guide you on the things that you may not be able to see. But don't overthink it. Don't spend months trying to find the best one, etc. When you need to be focusing on your business and the things that really matter. These are all shiny objects that get us distracted. All of these tools that the vehicle industry create are solutions to allow people to buy so that they can keep selling. Think about that.
Gee, I would pause if I were you listening. Pause, rewind 15 seconds, play that again, and then probably do that 3 times.
Yeah.
That's smart.
I'm out of here, mate. Anything else to finish up with?
No, mate, other than just recapping, it's about flexibility. Are you a car person? Are you not a car person? Cash flow, all of those kind of things that we just spoke about. But at the end of the day, involve your accountant. There's no tax hack. Go out there and crush it.